So I wanted to start by talking about what in this life of justice seeking and peacemaking and evangelical progressive proclamation is your true love, apparently, as we've been talking today and as I've been reading, and that is baseball coaching. I understand you've coached 22 baseball teams? Seasons. Yeah. Tell us about that.
Well, it's great to be back at Yale. I've been here before, but not for a long time.
There are actually stories about your being in the dorm and around seminary times, but we won't go to those.
So it's great to see all of you. Caitlin Hassler from Sojourners is also here. Raise your hand. So she's also from Sojourners. And one of your students, Peter, was an intern last year. So we got a lot of friends in the circle here. So, yeah, I was their Little League baseball coach, my two boys, Luke older and Jack younger. They're out of Little League now. 11 years, both of them in 22 seasons. So I remember one night I was putting Luke to bed. This is integrating baseball and faith.
Yes. How else?
So he was 9 years old, and he said, "Dad," just before bed, "I'm thinking about LSU." I said, "What?" "I'm thinking about LSU." "You're thinking what about LSU?" "They have a really good college team, really good at LSU." Now, I know you want me to pick a good academic school. How is LSU on academics? I said, "Well, there's some improvement that could happen there." "Oh, okay." So then he prayed, "Lord, thank you for the day and my family, and help LSU to get better academically." So we always integrate just faith and baseball. It was really a spiritual discipline, I would say, in my life, a bonding, anchoring with those two boys and all their friends, and of course our house was the clubhouse and all the parents. So there are we have different spiritual practices and disciplines, but that was one for me, anchoring, and probably the identity that I most love and identify with is this field next door to our house, actually. We moved there for the field where I'm just Coach Jim. So I love being Coach Jim.
Yeah, nice. Sports can be a bit of a religion in America, I suppose, which leads to a question about what really matters to faithful people these days. How is it that so much of the American church can be out of touch with the issues that are most pressing to us as a society? You've written some about this and how it is that we find a focus again about what's at the core of our faith and of our communal life together. Would you talk a little bit about that?
We're not just sitting here on a Friday night. Here's what I think is at stake as we sit here right now. What's at stake? I said this in our class. What's at stake is the soul of this nation right now, at stake. And what's at stake also is the integrity of faith. The nation's soul and the integrity of faith. And what we do and say now as people of faith is in fact going to shape the soul of this nation. As you probably know, the symbol, the Chinese symbol for crisis, the word crisis, is two symbols, danger and opportunity. You probably know that. We're now in that moment of a very perilous situation and very polarized. But one that I think has great opportunity if we do one thing. If we go deeper. 3 ways. Deeper into our relationship to God. Now, that might mean different things in a crowd like this, and we can talk about that too. But whatever it means, whatever the practices, disciplines, what drives us into a deeper relationship 2, into a deeper relationship with each other, particularly across racial and religious lines. 3, a deeper relationship with those who are most vulnerable and are being so targeted, who are at greatest risk. Our relationship with them, not to be for them, or as Brittany Packnett, one of my favorite Black Lives Matter leaders, says, we don't need allies, we need accomplices. How do we be in solidarity with those who are deeply vulnerable and targeted right now? If we went deeper in those 3 ways, there's no telling what could happen in this country. Probably my best friend called me the night or the week after the election, and he said, what if in 20 years, historians look back and they say, this powerful movement of faith that we see all around us, it's changing so much. It's hard to believe that started the election of Donald Trump. Now, most of what I've been doing, you've been doing, goes way back. Trump is not the cause, he's a consequence of how, you know how Abraham Lincoln said in the first inaugural, leaders need to speak to the better angels of our nature. What do you do when you have a leader that speaks to our worst demons and shows how close to the surface our demons really are? That's not solved by just impeaching him, right? So what's at stake now is, I think that this is way beyond politics or way beyond the next election, though elections are important. The soul of the nation and the integrity of faith and the opportunity we have right now to go deeper, which I think is happening all across the country. Right now with high school students in Florida who I'm in love with. We can talk about them later on too.
I do want to follow. I want to say, what are the signs? Is this aspirational, or are you actually seeing communities going deeper in those 3 areas?
Well, boy, I see lots of things. The Dreamers just lost another vote in the Senate. Now, I know Dreamers, Sojourners has hired Dreamers, working for us, with us. I've marched around the Capitol with Dreamers many times. Those are, the young people who came here as children, and they lost another vote. But the Dreamers have changed the narrative of the country. Most Americans, most Republicans and Democrats, are supportive of the DACA kids. They've changed people's thinking, a lot of people, about immigrants. So they're now changing a narrative. Policy doesn't change. I teach at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown. What I'm trying to get those students to understand is policy changes because narratives change. How do we change a narrative?
Right.
Narrative changes policy. And so those kids are changing our narrative. We haven't won yet, but there are political reasons why. I mean, there was one day 2 years ago when we had a bipartisan, comprehensive immigration reform bill. Republicans, Democrats, and literally there were 6 of us faith leaders who spent the whole day with the Republican leadership. Paul Ryan was there. Boehner was there. And we said, we have support for this all over the country. Just put it up for a vote in the House of Representatives. And, well, we don't like big bills. Okay, break it down. Here are the parts of it. And I was in the speaker's office they were showing me the parts of the bill they'd broken down. Everything we wanted was there on the table. So put it up for a vote. They promised us, face it, Paul Ryan promised us 3 Catholic bishops representing the Catholic Bishops' Conference and 3 evangelical leaders. 6 of us. They promised us, and they broke their promise. because of what we'll talk about tomorrow, gerrymandered congressional districts, and a rule that they won't put anything up that the whole caucus doesn't support. A racialized strategy to keep a vote for coming up like that vote. So, but dreamers and the undocumented are changing us. Black Lives Matter is an amazing movement, and I was in South Africa when Michael Brown was killed in that August, and I came home and I heard all these church leaders saying, you know, they're not churched, these Black Lives Matter people. They're not from the churches, and they don't respect our history, and you know, most of them don't go to church, and it's got to come from the church, all this stuff. Or as one of them said to me, one of the Ferguson leaders, yeah, the first pastor who showed up told me to go home. So I went to Ferguson, and it wasn't true. They were unchurched insofar as the church wasn't churching their neighborhoods. That's true. But most of them believed in God or something or whatever, and they wanted to connect. And Brittany Packnett, you know, who I love to talk about, she's from a black church family, mom, dad, and the rest, but a millennial, so she lost her faith. It's part of being a millennial, right? But when she, as the head of Teach for America, decided not to hear from her kids in the morning about what happened at night, but go on the streets with her kids at Teach for America, she faced rubber bullets, tear gas, and not knowing if she'd live or die, and that brought her back to God, brought her back to her faith. So that movement is a whole new generation, in continuity with the whole previous generation. I find it very exciting. And let's say the high school kids, these are young people who have realized they're not safe. Now, kids telling their parents, I'm not safe, am I going to be shot today, am I going to die, is not a foreign question for parents of color. We've had that for a long time. But these kids are saying to all the parents now, no matter where they are, this city was named last month the safest city in Florida. Kids say, we're not safe, because an older generation and their lawmakers have allowed them not to be safe because of the situation we're in with guns. So they're focusing on that. And all the Washington pundits are saying, well, you know, they don't know how hard it is to change gun policy. I know all the stuff that those pundits know. I faced it, I know it, I fought it, I've lost to it before. But these young people, they really believe they're going to change this. They really do. And I get so nostalgic because I remember when I was their age. We had this war going on that my friends and classmates were being sent to and dying, and all the Vietnamese we were learning about that were being brutally killed. And a war was based on lies. Now the movie The Post talks about how the Pentagon Papers showed it was all falsehood and deception. They were lying to us, and we said, we're going to stop that war. They said, you couldn't. We did. We stopped that war. So there's no telling, and these kids know how to communicate with each other more than any of us in this room. They are plugged into social media, they are ready, they are willing, and so what I'm thinking for the church is, many of these kids I suspect are not church-going kids, perhaps. What if the church didn't wait for them to come in, but said, hey, you need a place to meet? For a meeting, after school, somewhere to reflect, just sit and be quiet, deal with your grief, have town meetings in the community beyond being partisan about guns and what to do. You haven't heard this just yet, but last night we heard there are 3 car companies that decided to no longer have a discount for NRA members. 3 car companies, right? A bank in Omaha said they're not going to give NRA bank cards out anymore. This happened last night. So I got thinking last night, Caitlin, what about a church boycott of the NRA? How would those young people feel if the churches say, we're going to boycott primarily and secondarily? We're going to not go to car companies that don't dump their relationship. So I think, I've seen too much change to not believe in change. I learned my theology of hope in South Africa. I saw it happen, from apartheid to the inauguration of Nelson Mandela. Mm-hmm. So when you have young people who believe that they're going to change, when kids in Soweto, I met at 14, when I would say, are your kids going to breathe free air in South Africa? 14-year-olds. During apartheid, when those kids look at you and say, I will see to it that my kids breathe free air, you knew apartheid was done. It just was a matter of how long. So yeah, there are lots of stuff I see.
You've been writing about white privilege as, let's talk about white privilege as a theological issue.
So Yale has lots of authors who write books. You got a lot of your friends and faculty. So what happens when you're an author is people write you and say, I've read your book, we've read your book, can you come talk to us about your book? You have a book gathering, right? So I got this letter after writing a book. It said, we've read your book, we'd like you to come and talk to us about it. Typical letter, but this one was from the inmates at Sing Sing Prison in upstate New York. They're reading a book I wrote called The Soul of Politics. So we're all reading your book, could you come and talk to us? Sounded interesting, so I wrote back and said, when do you want me to come? This young brother writes back and says, well, we're free most nights. He said, we're kind of a captive audience here. So New York Theological Seminary has a program inside the walls of Sing Sing where they graduate students to get their certificates. They're Masters of Divinity inside the walls. I got to do commencement there later on. So I went, and they gave us a room in the bowels of that infamous prison. And I had 50 guys for 4 hours. And one of them said something I'll never forget. He said, Jim, almost all of us here at Sing Sing, almost all of us, the whole prison, are from 4 or 5 neighborhoods in New York City. 4 or 5 neighborhoods. He said, it's like a train. It starts in neighborhoods like mine. You get out when you're 9 or 10 years old. The train ends up here at places like Sing Sing. It's a train. Tomorrow we're going to deal all day with what I believe is America's original sin. It's a train. Train only starts at certain zip codes. Ends up at Sing Sing. But he said, when I get out, I'm going to go home and stop that train. He's now Bishop Darren Ferguson in New York, at home stopping the train. It's like a train. So you said theologically, okay? On MLK Day, I always do, somewhere MLK talk on that day. This year was Grand Rapids, Michigan, one of the whitest cities in Michigan. Calvin College students and Christian Reformed Church, one of the whitest churches in America. And I heard them all saying, whenever we do MLK days and bring in all the people who care about that, he said, they always say we're bringing politics into the church. How many of you have ever been told that? You're bringing politics into the church. So I said, well, let's think about the Reverend Doctor, Martin Luther King Jr., and John Calvin, if they ever met. They'd talk about theology, I know they would. So let's bring, I said, theology into the church, and theology into our politics. Here's the theology of white privilege. It is a deliberate overturning of the first chapter of Genesis. In the beginning, with all the noise around, think of all the noise about race. And then God said, it says, then God said, let us make them in our own image and likeness. So God created every human being in the image of God. But the Christians in Britain and America knew they couldn't do what we were doing to indigenous people and kidnapped Africans. We couldn't do that to people who were made in the image of God. So we said they weren't. They weren't made in the image of God. They were 3/5 of a person. Now, you think that's old history. On the streets of Ferguson, one night I met this kid who said, I still feel like I'm treated like 3/5 of a person. On the Ferguson streets, as existential as it could possibly be. So we had slaveries before in our history, but the Romans had Greek slaves, and the Greek slaves tutored the Roman elite children. They didn't say they weren't made in the image of God. They didn't strip them of their kids. They didn't destroy their families. But we did that for the greed of slavery. So the original sin isn't slavery. Slavery is a horrible thing. It was the idea of racial difference, racial superiority, racial inferiority, saying that no, we're not all made in the image of God. This is about we threw away Imago Dei. We threw away, we Christians, I'm a Christian, we threw away Imago Dei. Repentance, which is what you do for sin, doesn't mean, in all of our traditions, Jewish, Christian, Islamic, the word does not mean feeling sorry or feeling bad or having shame. It means turning around and going in a whole new direction. That's what the word means. So, white privilege. As I said, every reporter out of this last book tour would ask that question. What do you mean white privilege? So I'm in my home office and in walks my son Luke and Cameron, one of his teammates on the baseball team. If you have athletes as kids, you know their best friends are their teammates on their teams. So, well, Cameron and Luke just walked in, they're doing their homework for an hour, then go into baseball practice. When they walk out the door, Luke and Cameron both know that Luke is safer than Cameron, because Cameron's African American. Any door in Washington, D.C., and Luke is a white kid. And it pisses both of them off. Right? So, going around the country on this book tour, often doing town, Caitlin was around most of that, town meetings with all kinds of panels and diverse respondents. At the end of the day, you know, when it's all done and you're just kind of hanging out and talking with all the respondents and all the panelists, it didn't matter low income, high income, job, vocation. What is the difference that parents of color feel than the white academics? And safety. Our kids aren't safe. My kids are safe. Their kids aren't safe. My class at Georgetown, a white young student, she says, I went to Sidwell, you know, where Barack Obama's kids, Barack and Michelle, their kids go, their girls go. My two best friends, Chase and Sarah, and they're dating. Chase is black and Sarah is white, and they're just downtown D.C., not Alabama, Washington, D.C. cop comes up and says to Sarah, "Ma'am, are you okay?" Sarah says, "Yeah." "What do you mean?" Turns to Chase and scowls and says, "Are you on substances?" Chase says, "No." "You carrying him?" "No." "On the ground." Chase is on the ground, and Sarah calls Chase's mother, who's a top black lawyer in D.C. It's a black woman lawyer telling Sarah what to tell her son to keep him safe. She's terrified. Chase is clean. Cop says, "Okay, you can go this time." Never check Sarah's purse with a bag of marijuana inside her purse. We're going to do some police storytelling tomorrow in the class, and I guarantee we're going to hear stories like that. This is happening today. This is acknowledging what's happening today, every day in this country. We are living in different countries in the same country. And the most important political fact in this country, underneath everything, is that by 2040 or so, we're no longer going to be a white majority nation. We're going to be a majority of minorities for the first time. And that, building that bridge to that new America, someone's going to have to help us navigate that. Why wouldn't that be the faith community? To help us navigate. Well, we're going to talk tomorrow more about this, but the phrase white Christian, the operative word in the phrase is not Christian. It's white. White Christianity, theologically, is not just a myth. I mean, whiteness, it's a myth, it's an ideology. Whiteness is an idolatry. White Christianity is an idolatry. Well, what do idols do? They separate us from God. So liberal left folks all want to be helpful on racism, and it's about other people, and we want to use our privilege and influence to help. No, it's about the soul of white Christians. What does it mean to live a lie all the time? What does that do to your spirit when you're living a lie? White supremacy is a lie. We live it all the time. And the best answer I ever heard to, in one of our town meetings, to a white person asking, "What is white privilege?" Young African-American kid says, "If you don't know it, you got it." So this is about the healing and the spiritual health of the nation and the churches. So this is much more than politics. Mm-hmm. And I'll say one more thing. This white privilege question from white people is always underscored by how white people want to privatize everything. The greatest heresy of the American churches is the privatizing of the gospel. Wait, I'm not a racist. My people came after slavery. My folks didn't own slaves. I have a black friend. What's their name? I have a black friend. Or I have black colleagues. I'm not a racist. That is the dumbest answer. I'm not a racist. My dad came home from World War II in the Navy. He was a GI. And like every GI like my dad, we got a GI Bill, our family, an FHA loan, free education, and our first house. When my government gave my family education and housing, my government made me middle class. No black GIs got either. GI Bills, FHA loans. That didn't happen in Detroit. So our racial geography in Detroit was never accidental. Purposeful policy. So when I talk to pastors about what they're trying to do and deal with their white congregations and privilege, racial geography has controlled our ecclesiology. We'll deal with that tomorrow in class. Racial geography has controlled our ecclesiology. Repentance means changing that. So to me, these issues are theological. That's why I jumped on that. They're theological, not just political. Does that make sense? I know it's sometimes hard to hear, but these are theological issues for us. Let's bring theology back into our churches. And when our politics is undermining our theology, as it is now, how do you bring theology to that politics?
I'm going to guess you have some questions. Nathan.
Thank you for being here.
Sure.
I'm pursuing ordination in the Episcopal Church. I used to work for Obama for this year, but I want to keep doing that kind of work now from a faith perspective. And I'm trying to discern where to root such a justice ministry. A nonprofit like Sojourners or in a parish, whether it's a rector or associate rector in the community. What are the advantages and the disadvantages to those different approaches to justice?
Yeah, great question. I think it's a matter of vocation. A woman just joined us as our communications director, and she was the director for the farm workers for years, and really good. And she then did a 2-year personal called C.S. Lewis study program in D.C., deepen her personal faith, joined us because she wants to put her faith together with her work as a communications director. But another member of our staff was working at Sojourners and decided that he just felt called to plant a church, start a church. And so he's done that. And Joy and I go to that church. And there, he's wrestling now with how do you do social justice with a diverse congregation. So, and I say to pastors like him, we've got to love our people enough to preach the gospel to them, you know? And when I look at who's going to navigate this bridge, this road to the new demographic America, we'll talk tomorrow about how underneath the immigration battle is that fact about there are people who want to not allow our demographics, which are changing, to change our democracy. So the image of God is the theological foundation, but the new voter ID law in North Carolina, requiring IDs that William Barber will tell you all about when he comes, was named by a North Carolina court as surgically directed at minorities. That's a denial of the image of God in black voters in North Carolina. Alabama, there were 8 counties in Alabama where the DMVs were shut down 2 days before the election, but only black counties. Keep from getting voter IDs. That's image of God being suppressed. Voter suppression is suppressing the image of God. So we're not in this because we're Democrats or good citizens. This is about, for us, about the image of God. And so how do we address that? And then each of us vocationally, where are our gifts, our callings? To me, I teach at Georgetown because of vocation. Because those students, they're going to shape the world one way or the other. So it isn't information, it's formation. It's vocation. So where do your gifts, whether you're religious or not, where do your gifts meet the crying needs of the world, and right there's your vocation. And then we say, what's your gift? That's what's your gift? Well, it's the difference in career and vocation. Career is you assemble your assets for your resume. I've just done this with my son, who's at sophomore at Haverford now, and playing baseball, of course. It's what is the vocation, not just the career. Those are very different words. So what are the gifts? And what do you lose track of time when you're doing? What goes down to that deepest place? What are you really best at? What were you probably put on this planet to do? And how does that connect to where our world is? So for some it's a pastor, some it's an organizer, some it's a teacher, all kinds of things we can do. But where is the place where you can get that kind of vocational discernment? I find very few young people, students, get the kind of help they need to answer your question at most of their schools. Career counselors are saying, what's your niche where you can start on the highest ladder, rather than what's my vocation and where right now in the society, at this moment in time, where could I invest myself?
We talked in class a little bit about trusting questions. And this seems to be related, I think. How to dare to trust the questions that really matter.
Well, I just often suggest that we trust our questions and follow them to wherever they take us. That, for me, has been the starting point. I had these questions in Detroit. Something seemed really big and really wrong. But nobody in my white church, white school, white neighborhood would even talk about it. Wouldn't talk about it. So I had to take my questions into the city, and there I found the black church and found young people like me who were working, me for college, them to support their families, and I learned that we had grown up in different countries in the same city. But if I hadn't followed the questions, I wouldn't have learned anything. And my experience is, I've learned most about the world from going places I was never supposed to be and meeting people I was never supposed to know. That's what changed my worldview, and still does, over and over again. So trust the questions, and don't listen when they say you're too young to ask those questions. When you get older, you'll understand. Or we don't know why it's that way, but that's the way it's always been. Or the honest answer is if you keep asking that question, you're going to get in lots of trouble. That's an honest answer. The young people in Florida, they are taking their questions and not letting anybody say that shouldn't be the question. Yeah?
How does spiritual leadership look like to you at a time like this?
The current issue of Sojourners has a cover line which asks the question. The question is this a Bonhoeffer moment? And the issue sold out quickly. A lot of church leaders and pastors are asking that question. Bonhoeffer, his question was always, who is Jesus Christ for us today? I'm not making simplistic parallels. History doesn't repeat, it rhymes, but we got to learn from past experiences. We're in deep danger in this society. So how do we take theology, not partisan politics, to bear on that? What are the questions when there are issues with what the truth is? When you've got patterns of persistent lying that change expectations in the culture, what does it mean to listen to Jesus who says, you will know the truth and the truth will make you free? When lying enslaves us, what does it mean to say that Jesus is my truth and my light? Rather than just talking about free press, which I'm all for. But when racial bigotry, which is an offense against God, when racial bigotry is the denial of the image of God, what does it mean for white Christians to say, I didn't vote for him because of his racial bigotry, but for other reasons? And black Christians say back to their white brothers and sisters, I guess racial bigotry isn't a deal breaker for you. Racial bigotry is a gospel deal breaker. treatment of women that is now ignored or covered up or not paid attention to at the highest levels of power, it is a denial of Galatians. In Christ, there is no male or female, Jew or Gentile, bond or free. That's saying that the divisions of race and class and gender, which control the world, that we're to be overcoming those in the body of Christ. And if we aren't doing the work of the gospel. Or on the black church, white church question, what do you do when 72% of white churches, white Christians, say the shootings of young people of color by police, lethal shootings, are isolated incidents by the poll? When black Christians, 82% of black Christians say they're part of a pattern. In my life too. 72%, 82%. What does that mean about what the white church is saying to black churches? You're making this up? You're exaggerating? It's that they are like 70% of most white Americans today who have no significant relationship or family of color in their social circles. 70%. That's not less true of the Christians. So we don't know each other's experience. So how do we go deeper? Our relationship to God, to each other, across lines, and then to those who are targeted. I think it means putting theology back into our politics. And you're going to see more and more of that conversation about what it means to be a confessing church. What does it mean to be an underground church? Bonhoeffer started at Finkenwald an underground seminary during those terrible days. More and more of that conversation is taking place at the highest levels of the church and with pastors. Two here. Yeah, please. Go ahead.
So, as somebody, as a minority pastor in churches, youth minister, the director of Vocation, I understand saying, bring theology back into the churches. But I'm curious how minorities, these positions of power, tend to speak to majority of churches that are mostly populated. Like I struggle with how am I supposed to do this as a minister or as a leader in the church when inherently my voice may not be heard or validated. So voice, I don't know if there's an answer to this, but how to navigate that tension. This is just more so discerning what ministry looks like to me, and I'm supposed to be doing this and reclaiming, how do I do this when it feels like I'm behind?
Well, I don't know how things are here at Yale, but theology normally is, we have liberation theology and Latin American liberation theology. Then we have Minjung theology. In Asia, we have black theology. And then we have theology. The assumption is theology is white European American theology. And the rest are kind of extracurricular. I don't want to be too harsh here, but I'm saying there's this notion of where theology is and what is dominant, and then the other theologies, which at least are giving voice to, they're kind of on the side. How many white students at mainline seminaries are required to take black theology as a requirement? I don't know, here or wherever else. You're from the Philippines. My dear friend Carl Gaspar is a Redemptorist brother. You know the Redemptorists in the Philippines. And he's my son's godfather. And when I go there to see him, you literally have to get on the plane, fly to Manila, then go to Mindanao, and then you got to get to a bus, and then you get to a bicycle, and then you're literally crossing the river with water up to your chest, with your suitcase over your head, going to where Carl is living with the poorest of the poor, and he's an actor and a creative poet and songwriter, and he's doing Christmas plays with the kids in the community that are full of political implications for the dictatorship of Ferdinand Marcos. So he got put in jail and spent 2 years in jail under Marcos, and we got him saved and out. But he's doing theology in the real world of the people he's working with. Now, I think, the big battle is and the big conversations, what does it mean to have theology done by people who for a long time, who have been living in different worlds, in even the same cities, and who have very little contact with each other's churches, and where white churches, they'd say, okay, what is the Asian American perspective on that? And I know that in the Asian American community, as you know, there are hierarchies there too. Chinese, Japanese, Pacific Islanders, Filipinos near the bottom, as you know. So how is that even talked about in the churches? Or the Hispanic community, Florida Cubans to New York Puerto Ricans? Really? The black community. So how do we navigate this bridge to a new America, as I think the faith community really might be the only folks who could do. And we're going to be bumping, as Brian Stevenson says, we're going to be bumping into each other along the way. If this narrative, the issue is the narrative. Brian said in an interview last week, he said, the North won the Civil War, but the South won the narrative. Think about that. In Montgomery, Alabama, black kids go to Robert E. Lee School. Brian's building a museum to lynching in Montgomery, Alabama. I'm sorry, I should sit back where the camera is. He's changing the narrative, right? So the faith community has to change the narrative. And that will change policy, but the narrative has to change in us first. So you're talking about the hierarchies in leadership, racially, but also gender-wise. I mean, my wife is one of the first women ordained Church of England, but, even in places where women are ordained, the hierarchies are still very, very real. So Galatians is a joke, or it's something we believe, or Corinthians says when one part of the body suffers, what does it say? We all suffer, right? So what does it mean when the black or Hispanic or Asian American part of the body is suffering, and the white part of the body doesn't even acknowledge the pain? That's a Corinthian problem. We're violating Corinthians. So we tend not to go to the text or not to go to our theology. We make it all political, and we have politics of diversity, all that's fine, but this is a deeper issue for us. We're going to talk about immigration tomorrow in the class. Immigration is changing this entire nation. I mean, no church in America, no church is growing except by immigration. Not just Catholics, but Southern Baptists. And so why are some churches changing their minds and hearts in immigration? 3 things. They're reading their Bibles and not just thumping them. They're forming relationships across racial lines that are changing them. And they know their only growth in the future is with the people Jesus called the stranger. And Leviticus says, I love to quote Leviticus at press conferences. Leviticus says, you should treat the stranger like you treat the citizen. That's a test of your worship to God. So these questions have to be honestly dealt with in our churches. And as you know, when I was in Detroit, it was all black and white. That's not true anymore. It's African American, Hispanic, Asian American, and all the hierarchies within those communities. Where is the community where those things are going to be navigated and understood and dealt with theologically? But you're right, those are the questions. Race, gender. You were next, speaking of gender.
So my question actually picks up on some of what you were just saying.
Yeah.
This idea of what the church is going to be looking like.
Yeah.
And during the Trump campaign, Christian intellectual colleague and I were doing some writing about the integration of the church, the multiracial church, immigration, growing numbers of Christians, non-white looking Christians. And so we were trying to kind of get some pieces out in the public sphere about this. And we consistently got rejected. And both of us have published a fair amount, so it's not like we didn't know what we were doing. And the feedback from people who were maybe grew up in more of an African American context was that you can't expect the black church to change. The black church has a very sacred place in American history and has been the safe haven for African American communities, et cetera, right? So this is sort of the role and the importance of the black church, no question, right? But then the white church, people who were sort of more comfortable with the white church context, would say, well, you know, if we're not going to expect, you know, the other side to change, then why should we change? Why should we integrate? And I think it was kind of whichever editor was reading us, whatever their comfort zone was, there was a lot of finger pointing in the other direction. And so these various pieces we were working on the church ended up going nowhere. We couldn't find a place that was comfortable publishing things that made both sides uncomfortable. And I guess my question for you is this had me thinking a lot about this. So we can say to the white church, like, look, you're going to become more multiracial, so you might as well accept it. Maybe we can say that. And then, you know, the response might be, well, we're a historically white church. But from what editors were saying, you can't ever say that to the black church. You can't say to the black church, look, the population, you know, it's a different church. And so I wonder if you could speak to that. Something that I guess I'm still wrestling with.
The problem isn't racial tension and conflict, and we have to deal with both sides. That's not the problem. What we're repenting of is white supremacy. There's no moral equivalence here. Now, any good black church leader will tell you the black church isn't perfect. There's all kinds of things going on in black churches. Prosperity gospel is coming into black churches. All kind of stuff going on. But this is a matter of what does it mean to see how our original sin is not just privatized or about relationships, it's systemic and structural, like the FHA loan and the GI Bill. My parents were wonderful Christian people, and when their kids brought home colored jokes they heard at school or from other parents, my parents would say, we don't talk like that in this house. We don't make fun of people because of the color of their skin. They were adamant about that. But we lived in this neighborhood of 3-bedroom ranch houses, all headed up by a GI who was white. Were they even aware of that? No. Was I aware of that? No. It's systemic and structural. And so until we deal with the systemic structural issues, for example, you know, the issue isn't just let's get a white church and black church together to share a preaching transfer every 6 months and have our choir. Wouldn't that be a wonderful thing? How about this? How about a multi-faith campaign to prevent voter suppression in 2018? Multi-faith to fight voter suppression, which is planned. There is a Washington-based strategy to repress the votes of black voters. It isn't just kind of happening, they're planning it. Racial gerrymandering, immigration reform that doesn't lead to a path to citizenship for 11 million undocumented people because they'd be mostly brown voters. Mass incarceration, we'll talk tomorrow. Brian Stevenson says slavery never ended, it just evolved. more people in jail, more black people in jail than black people in slavery before the Civil War. And what happens when they get out of jail, having turned nonviolent drug offenses into felonies, they lose their vote. If all the disenfranchised black and brown people in Florida could have voted last time, Florida would have totally been different. This is systemic, right? So I want to see people of faith do more than say, let's get to know each other's cultures. Let's work together on repenting from this sin that threw away Imago Dei. And now, so changing those, so it was a whole conversation about there's a lot of black churches. When you have a black church, because blacks couldn't go to white churches, and it becomes the whole infrastructure and community and sustaining of your life, that's a critically important place. And there's all kinds of stuff going on. There's a generational thing going on. There's a whole mixed race thing going on. All that is happening. But we have to repent of the sin of white supremacy, which is very practical, very real, very systemic. So I want to see white people working with people of color on those issues. That's going to be more meaningful and lead to more relationship than just let's share our choirs, right? Share our pastors, right, Bill? We don't need just to have a, you need to see, and you should speak to white Christian leaders committing to repentance, meaning turning around of these racial sins. Then you'll see relationship growing, right?
Jim, can you describe a community or two where we should keep an eye on, where this is happening?
Which is happening?
Well, I would guess it would mean where there is a strong black voice that a white community is also gathering around and listening to. I'm not sure what it would look like exactly, but where white privilege is being tossed aside, where that sin is being encountered and confessed, and where community is being built.
Well, when we went around the country to talk about, it was a book tour,
yeah,
but it was about all these questions. Caitlin and I were going around talking about this. I would say most nights in Seattle, pretty white city, but 1,000 people turn up, and a very multiracial crowd for Seattle. But we have a panel about what's happening in Seattle. What does this mean for Seattle? What's happening here? And local people and their black pastors, Muslim women, Hispanic organizers, all talking together about how do we bring this to Seattle, or what's happening here. I would come home from those nights usually pretty encouraged,
yeah,
by what is happening and being talked about in many places. Then I turn on the hotel news, and it's really depressing. There are both things are happening in a parallel way. We had very multiracial, intergenerational crowds of people almost every place doing really pretty exciting things.
But those were not churches.
Well, some of them were hosted by churches,
Okay.
where churches became...
I'm wondering if it needs to not be a Christian conversation.
Well, or it was a conversation, sometimes,
Or just a Christian
sometimes they're led by bookstores.
Yeah.
Bookstores that do town meetings, great places where people feel safe to come. But sometimes there were churches that had, we had one in Minneapolis, and it was led by a black-led Lutheran church. Okay, they hosted it. But I walked in, and here's this Lutheran suburban church, all white. They'd come too for the first of a 10-part series. And then a whole bunch of kids came in and sat in the front row, clearly street kids. So I'm thinking, wow, this church must be reaching out to street kids, because they're here too. They weren't. They were the leadership of the Black Lives Matter kids in Minneapolis who had just torched the police station down the road 2 weeks before. We wanted to hear about this. So this white Lutheran pastor has the question cards. And in a very white Lutheran way, he read them very articulately. And the kid in the front row said, "That's not what I said." And the white pastor says, "Oh!" I said, "Okay, what did you say? Let's hear it from you." And I saw Black Lives Matter, Black Lutherans, white Lutherans having a conversation for 2 plus 3 hours after we all held hands and did a benediction together. Now, I don't see that every day, but that is possible. And if our churches become places that are safe venues and places for that kind of conversation, a lot of things are possible. We were at a meeting, Calvin College, and I said the churches, the faith community, and including mosques and synagogues, we could be the community that helps navigate this bridge. And they all began clapping. I said, no, don't clap. We haven't done it yet. Right. You know, we haven't done this yet. So there's an imam on the south side of Chicago who's doing one of the best programs to combat recidivism that I've ever seen. When you're getting let out of jail, literally you get bus fare, and that's it. Yeah. So they go to the jail, pick up the prisoners, and they take them back to a place where they get housing and food and rest and counseling and job training and jobs. Really working, just turning around recidivism until it got stopped by the parole people in Chicago, because a parole rule is you can't hang around with former felons. The thing is being run by former felons who know how to get out of this. So that's a Muslim-led program. And what if the churches helped that program get rid of that stupid law in the parole system to let those prisoners come back to that program? That's the kind of deeper inner faith, inner religious conversation we have to have. Doing things in the world that represent what you say you believe about your faith. And then the young people who are watching, what they're looking for is, they want their lives to make a difference. They're looking for courage. When they see people of faith doing those things, they're going to say, that's interesting. Look where this is happening. So that's the way you get a whole intergenerational conversation going. So I actually see a lot of hopeful signs around the country, but the dominant narrative is so depressing and discouraging, because this is James Baldwin. You all know James Baldwin, I hope. James Baldwin said in 1963, before we had the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, he said, "I see the death of white supremacy. I see it dying, but I don't know how long the funeral will be." So white supremacy is not going to sort of fade away easily by itself, right? In some ways, the present political leadership is the last, some say, hopefully, the last death knell. I've heard that of white supremacy. I hope that's true. Could also be the new assertion of a new Jim Crow. This bill that the White House, I'm going to get specific here, the bill the White House wanted to pass on immigration, which would have changed legal immigration dramatically, not just undocumented, but legal. If you do the math on that bill and the populations, that bill would have extended white majority presence for 5 years. Just do the math, right? So we're up against a reassertion. And the reassertion of white privilege isn't just Charlottesville, where we can all say, oh, we're not like them. I'm not like those guys. It's systemic, it's structural. And until we deal with that, we're not going to be respond to the problem. But I think we can. It's not ready to applaud yet, but I think we can, if we have an honest conversation about this. A few more? Yeah, please. And I think there's one back here, too. Go ahead.
As we're talking,
Yeah.
I'm reminded of a great book I'm reading, Waking Up White by Debbie Irving. Are you familiar with this book?
Heard of it.
Talk about repentance. This is a woman of great white privilege status who, as she grew into adulthood, it's all autobiographical,
Yeah.
recognized the racism in herself and has really gone about very consciously trying to change this in herself, and
Yeah.
she writes about it with great honesty. Anyway, my point is, I'm at the point in the book where she says, at 2020 we're going to have a census. You're going to have to check what box that you are in terms of race. And she said, why do we even have the categories? What does it matter? And I've just been poised at that question, and I think what I'm trying to say is that that's such a Christian idea, and there's no mention of faith as part of her motivation in her book. And I'm thinking, theology, you're saying we need to bring theology into the church?
If we're people of faith.
If we're people of faith.
Yeah.
But I think theology is leaving the church, that God has taken Christianity outside the church, and people are getting it. And it seems like the churches are scratching their heads. Well, how come we're not on the forefront of that, or at least not enough of us?
Yeah, I literally have put my life, my body, my life, in the hands of friends who are agnostic or atheist. So no trouble on my part with solidarity with all kinds of people, not just different faiths, but people of no faith at all. But historically, most of the social movements that we all look to and point to were never just people of faith. Abolition, civil rights, anti-apartheid, never. If a movement is just people of faith, it won't succeed. But the most successful ones have had faith communities as an animating core of those movements. Open to everybody, but there was an animating core. And we were talking today in Dexter Avenue Church in Montgomery, Alabama. Dr. King, this 26-year-old minister, is preaching, and they're doing a bus boycott. And every Sunday morning, people would go because they're tired without using buses of getting to work, and they got to get inspired. Then they go to the foyer, and that's where the carpools get organized, in the foyer. So the faith community at its best is an animating core. It's never just us, never just us. And we got to work with people who are very different than we are, but that doesn't mean there isn't a role for us to play in those movements.
One more, yeah.
Please, yeah.
I hate to change the subject, but I'm talking about a little global preoccupation that I have. I worked among the poor for many years in community development, and I have my impression, and I'm giving you the opportunity to convince me otherwise, is that the environmental agenda is directly opposed to the fight against world economy.
The environmental agenda.
Opposes the fight against world economy.
How's that?
It's obvious, isn't it? Restricting the ways that agriculture can expand and the industry in general, the incentives, the chemical usage of whatever, and everything that has increased the crop to get us to the place today.
Okay. Let's go back to the end of that text in Genesis 1, where it says, God says, I will create them in our likeness and image, so that they together will have, and the word is dominion, but it means stewardship over all of the other creatures. And so one people instead decides to have dominion over other peoples, right? But the whole idea of stewardship is, how do you steward the resources of the earth so that human beings flourish? So I understand all the politics of, there's a big debate in the World Bank about a dam in Africa that's needed for this and that, but it's going to fight. There are competing agendas in politics. That's true. But what does it mean to together, all of us who are in the image of God, having this mission of the stewardship of God's creation in a way that all of us in God's image flourish. So you can have debates about agricultural limits and power, and I think we have a campaign at Sojourners called Environmental Justice, because if you put all of the toxic waste dumps in this country on a map, and then you put a template of all the places poor people of color live, it's all the same places. So the environmental movement has been too often a very white movement. It's talked about the environment instead of social justice. So what does environmental justice mean? What does it mean to take agriculture seriously and energy and all the rest? Those aren't easy questions. But I think, again, theologically, they should be integrated. There was one more hand here I want to give a chance. Okay.
You may have started to talk about it a little bit when you talked about the example, I think it was from Seattle with the church. But what narrative has to change to begin to change the racial geography that you said is controlling theology? Talk about that.
So my 5th grade son, Jack, when he was in the fifth grade, was studying immigration in his class in school, 5th grade. And so they often bring in parents who know something about an issue to come and talk to the kids. So I did. It was fun, and I coached most of those kids in baseball, so I knew them all. And I said to them, there are 11 million immigrants. They're undocumented. They don't have papers. And 11 million of them, and they can't get the health care they need. They can't get the police protection they need. And their families are being broken up by deportations. 11 million people. These 5th graders, their eyes just lit up and they were astonished and they were, that's terrible. We have to fix that. Congress should fix that. Have you talked to them? I said, yeah. What do they say? They say they're afraid, their constituencies are afraid where they live of immigration. Why are they, what are they afraid of? And then it hit me. There's this DC public school 5th grade class. And there they are. They're African American. They're Hispanic. They're Asian American, Native American. They're Samoan. They're Maltese. They're white. They're all there. And I just looked at those kids and I thought for them, I said, they're afraid of you. Kids said, afraid of us? Why are they afraid of us? Because you're the future of this country, what you are right now today. This is the future that people are afraid of. Why are they afraid? Well, they think it won't work. Tell me, is it working? Kid said, yeah, it's really cool. Well, our job, I said, is to help the rest of the country think this is really cool. But then in one of our sessions, somebody said, maybe they're afraid that it might work, right? So that class, now they're all in high school, and my son's 6'1". But that class remains to me an image of what the future is, and how can the churches, how can the faith community help the country see that is really cool. That's the narrative that I think we can change. And if you look at the early church, they were changing that narrative all the time. And that kind of narrative of we are, for the Christians here, one in Christ together. That was a driving force in that early church. And that's why it's still the most diverse human community in the world. So we have an American problem that has to be fixed. And I think it's time for a new generation to say, like they're saying in Florida, we're going to fix it. We're going to fix it.
Will you join me in thanking Jim Wallis?